digital identity of an individual is now more trusted than meeting that individual face to face. Friends are friends you may never have seen before. But in a digital environment, open access to information, spoofing technology, all allows somebody to pretend to be somebody else. And finally, there is not a downside for a criminal failing, as each time the criminal attempts to compromise a consumer, they learn where their consumer's social controls caught them. And once they know at which point the consumer's social controls caught them, they will create another attempt, a different identity that will go around those controls. So what can a consumer compromise look like? This is rising rather heavily in the last 2 years in the United States. And that is the consumer receiving the texts, asking if the consumer, and it appears to be the bank. Let me make sure that that's aware. So this bank text says you made a $500 payment. Did you actually do that? Respond yes or no. The customer will respond to that they did not do that $500 payment. And lo and behold, they will get a call from a number that appears to be the bank's number. That person will introduce themselves as the fraud department. They will talk to the customer and say, looking at the account, it looks like your entire account is compromised. We need to close things down immediately. Please stay on the phone while we go through all of the steps to close things down. And that step will include this person who is representing them as the bank's fraud analyst saying that you will receive one-time passcodes on your phone. This makes sure that I'm talking to the right person. Give them to me every time you receive one so I can close down another transaction. What is actually happening is that initial text was just looking to see if somebody would respond. And when they did, now this person who is the criminal wants to get one-time passcodes because they are in that person's account, but cannot complete a transaction without a one-time passcode. So they create the impression that these one-time passcodes are being delivered to protect the account, when in fact, as they are on the phone giving the one-time passcodes, the criminal is going through and doing as many transactions as they can. In this particular scenario, 50,000 US dollars were lost. So the mitigation of the consumer compromise, well, banks are investing in education campaigns. That is one of the largest things that sit out there, not just in the US, but in other countries, to address this. Because the consumer compromise occurs outside of the bank controls. These texts are not coming from the bank. These phone calls are not coming from the bank. The bank has no knowledge until the transactions are entered. They're also investing more and more in real-time fraud alerts, checking the behavioral biometrics, and again, AI-driven anomaly detection. But to go back to the first part of this with the customer education, that consumer participation is critical. It is very necessary that every consumer is aware of what this looks like, and they're armed to identify it themselves. What we've done is we've created campaigns inside the American Bankers Association. One of them called Banks Never Ask That. And it is humorous videos, social posts, digital signage to go through and give the customer ways to remember in small spaces. You will never actually hear this from the bank. That previous example, banks don't call you and then ask you to verify yourself. They were calling you on a trusted number. That scenario is more likely for when you call them, not the other way around. And we go through to make sure that customers understand the feeling of urgency and the feeling of I need to get these funds out should be red flags that have the customer take a moment and consider whether they should be doing this. We also engage political figures, government figures, to help that message get out. If you are just presenting each one of these messages from your bank, you're likely to get people to ignore the message. They see it as static. It is something they hear over and over again. But once you engage other individuals outside of your bank, like a political figure, you engage a different way for them to say this is serious. Now, another obvious way that fraud is growing is AI-enabled fraud. Common tactics are the voice cloning and the social engineering, as well as the AI-powered phishing. One of the things that I'm working with several countries is we're developing a paper on how AI is impacting fraud, is to make sure that people understand that AI itself is not necessarily a new fraud. It is a force multiplier for the fraud that is out there. So we're looking at increased speed, higher volume, and it's a hands-off fraud tool. It is not something that needs to have people watch what is going on through all of this. Now, the use of AI to fight AI is one of the more effective things to do. We want to make sure that more and more institutions pick up on knowing whether their vendors are an AI-enabled shop or not. The banks use it to detect real-time fraud and to expedite their investigations. It goes through scam detection, transaction fraud, and anti-money laundering. But as I talk about all of that, and I talk about how technology is definitely assisting the fraud space, I don't want to lose the fact that the manual processes are an important factor of that. It is the same concept of you do not just rely on one channel of communication with your customers. Use your manual processes, especially those that work. Your customer relationship groups know your customers. They will pick up on some nuances that a lot of technology cannot, to where technology will be able to never sleep and go through a multitude of transactions that human cannot. Humans can hear some of the emotional changes in the tone of voice. They can detect some changes in the communication online, whether it be a chat or an email. Always have those manual processes to back up your technology. And then again, consumer education. Now, one of the things I look at is advances in deepfake technology. This is one of the items that we created several years ago, actually, about 2 years ago. And what we did is we took one of the original videos of our CEO and his voice.
Thanks, Sylvan. We're pleased to be partnering with you on this event and excited to see the great lineup of speakers participating today.
We put that through actually a very inexpensive model to deepfake it. So that, both in a humorous way and in just a way to show how the technology works, is one of the things that when I specifically present on deepfake fraud, I like to identify how banks have relied on that live contact. We're seeing other countries, Australia is actually very good at this one, definitely going in there and using their contacts with the startups, the tech companies, and saying that we're all accountable for making sure that we can identify that this is out there. Now, in addition to that, we have some general fraud strategies that I want to make sure that we have for this presentation. So the American Bankers Association has several things that we're looking at here. And one of them is the ABA committees and working groups. We have payments working groups. We have a national best practice, internal fraud. All of these are groups of like-minded banks getting together regardless of their size. And they are talking about their practices in combating fraud. They are bringing up new techniques. Now, that is important because a collaborative model is one of the more effective ways to combat fraud. We also make sure that we have leadership in the financial services sector coordinating council. That includes the cloud computing, the research and development. It is not just a national, but an international committee to talk about how to combat all of these compromises, whether they be fraud or cyber fraud, through the emerging technology. Because one thing is clear, the technology that the banks have is equally available to the criminals, and the criminals will adopt it first to compromise the bank. Now, they may not be adopting the best version of it, and the banks are held to certain regulatory and rule standards to have a tested version, but that early adoption puts banks behind. Now, another thing that the ABA did when we talked about a collaborative model is we did a fraud claim directory. As you're looking at your situation, if you do not have a way to gather all of the contact information for your peers and other banks, if an association can support that, it is highly effective in reducing fraud. Otherwise, one bank attempting to contact another to speak to their peer are often delayed going through 1-800 numbers or trying to find somebody who had a previous contact. That directory is integral and very important. We have worked with our inspection services to combat check fraud. We have large amounts of check fraud. Check fraud is one of the largest loss figures in US banking, and I'm sure you're aware across the globe. As COVID came around and people were distancing themselves or staying at home, checks, which were decreasing in use, became a forefront. People learned that they can steal those pieces of paper, and that as a transfer device, it is a device that has the least amount of security. It's not technology. It is a piece of paper with its control being a signature. So it is something that criminals definitely want to take advantage of and have. They are using technology to get around all the controls that were built inside the banks to detect check fraud. The breaks and lines, the differences in font color, the security features of check stock are now not difficult to reproduce. So in that, we are also working on a fraud indicator exchange. This is one of the ones that we've been working on for a while and has slowly been producing more and more information for banks to share about what are the key indicators of recent fraud events. Things like the IP address, things like the geolocation, the times that these frauds occur, all of them to identify, is there a pattern or a practice that it's not just hitting one bank, but in the financial sector. Another effort that we're going through is advocacy. So we want to have a centralized government office for fraud prevention. In the United States, we have several fraud investigation spaces. I myself worked at the FBI as a special agent. My goal was to catch the criminal. But when you think about what you are trying to engineer inside a bank, you are trying to close the gap that allows fraud to take place. We want our government to think the same way. that this is not just a reaction model where the fraud takes place and you catch the person that did it. There should be an office saying there is a space where new fraud will come in. There is a space that we've seen that old fraud schemes are coming in. And here is a way to stop it. We want to create a fraud funds freeze framework. We developed this as an idea internally and representing some of the other countries that we've seen do this. A bank should be able to notify another bank quickly that those funds should be held, and almost immediate notice that those funds they have learned were a scam, account takeover, or a compromise. The bank that sends that notification will then go through the process of recovering the funds. But that immediate notification and freezing those funds is very important so that the criminal isn't paid. Otherwise, you are in an environment where it is more of a pressure of which bank holds the liability. And that becomes something that gets into the consumer's head, gets into the government's head to sit there and say, well, let's address this and change the rules so we know exactly which bank holds the liability. But if you listen to what I just said, as it gets into the consumer and the government's head, they're not thinking of what I just said before. Do not pay the criminal. So that freeze network is extremely important. One of the ways that can actually happen is a universal indemnification agreement. The bank that is asking that other bank to freeze the funds needs to cover if they were wrong. Another thing we are working on is a national check verification system. Like I said, the checks are inherently a risky product. Most of the detection of a check comes after it was negotiated and is inside the bank for clearing. We want a system, a technology to advertise what was that original check written for, who was it written to, so at the point of deposit it can be verified, rather than at the point it's already been negotiated with the person that's depositing. But bank to bank, they're trying to clear the funds. We respond to government's requests for information in our policy procedure efforts. We coordinate with our state associations. One of the big things is we want to have a safe harbor so that bank to bank fraud conversations are covered and they are not tripping up to privacy rules and regulations. So what does a coordinated national response look like? I said it before. If you have not seen the Australian Banking Association's model of how they are taking all of this together to create a shared responsibility, not just amongst banks, but amongst banks and telecom companies and social media companies, please look into the Australian Banking Association's model. It is a very effective way of ensuring that everybody is focused on preventing fraud. They've taken away all of the safe space that some companies have to where there were liability protections. And they said if you have the ability to advertise fraud protections, to put in tools, put those in. And instead of an automatic reimbursement, they are focused slowing down the suspicious payments. When I talked about the freeze network, when we looked to see if other countries are doing something similar, Australia was one of them. And that is something that is very effective for them. That resulted in a significant drop in losses. And we want to make sure that that is the type of thing that is repeated country from country to country. It's one of the items that when I'm talking bank to bank inside the United States, I do stress, let's have a consistent model at the level that makes you unappetizing to a criminal. Because if you're not in that space of consistency, a criminal will avoid one bank that has created those controls and target yours. It's not that they can't compromise your control. So you will hear in your business cases people say, well, can't I still compromise it? That is true. There is always a way to compromise control. But if I'm a criminal and I see that it is easier in another bank, that's exactly where I am going. I will tell you that I enjoyed having the UK Homeland Department and the Australian department in the same room as the Americans to discuss how we were addressing fraud. It was very eye-opening to American regulatory agencies to see, as they thought they were ahead of the other countries, they were behind. The investment in protecting the consumer wasn't taking that front seat that it should have. It was more of the how can a bank increase its marketing under protection? Just that simple change in view to protect the consumers actually has improved the trust in banking in both the UK and Australia. So that was a discussion that had to happen. And because it happened, now we are getting the agencies asking questions of how can we improve our fraud responses in the United States.